Hello, ladies and gentlemen, dear Julia. Thank you very much for inviting me to Paris to talk to you and a nice group of young and not so young scholars from all over the world being allocated here to talk about the idea of eternal peace, which is a pressing issue, of course, in particular, since the necessity to found something like the Institute for Independent Philosophers was, as we are all aware, the fact that there is a very disastrous and unjust war going on in Europe right now, and it forced many people to leave their country and to find conditions to continue philosophizing in a free spirit elsewhere. And therefore, I'm pretty honored to be here and being part of this endeavor. And I'm also pleased, due to some short notice changes, we moved into a different room. And we end up in the Salle Maurice Halbwachs now, which is also very touching to me. Because very recently in Weimar, where I live, the Bauhaus University Weimar decided to rename the Audimax, so the major auditorium, into Maurice Halbwachs Auditorium. Because as you probably know, Maurice Halbwachs was a sociologist who, briefly said, invented the idea of cultural memory or collective memory. And he was brought to the concentration camp Buchenwald and died there a few days before the camp was freed by the British or American soldiers. So we see that history is full of those kinds of unpleasant things. Okay, so I try to address some of these issues. Don't expect too much at the end of the day, but I try to address some of these issues by turning back to more traditional topics. And I'd like to begin with a picture I shot 2 days ago in the Louvre. You see Jacques-Louis David's depiction of the intervention of the Sabine women. And in case you may or may not know the mythology behind it, so this is a Roman myth, also told from a Roman perspective. And the preceding story is probably more famous. Preceding this situation depicted here, there was this famous rape of the Sabine women by Romans. So the Roman emperor, it's a mythological story, of course, Romulus found that there were 2 less women in Rome. And he thought that there is this a lack of this particular resource. And therefore, he decided to take unmarried women from the Sabine, and which was a neighboring city. And so they invited the people from Sabine to a festival to Rome. And during this event, they actually decided to use force and rape the unmarried women and take them away and throw the male and others out of the town. So first there was this struggle about resources, and then there is a treason. There's an obvious break of the unwritten law of hospitality performed by the Romans in this case. And so they raped the Sabine women. And a while later on, the people from Sabine decided to attack Rome in order to get their people back. Where this is taking place, so the father of one of these Sabine women, Hersilia, and her father is Tinus, he is attacking the Romans. This is Romulus with the Roman wolf. And the women decide to intervene, and this is very lively depicted here. So they move between the fighting people in order to stop them from killing each other, which is probably unexpected because they were the victims of the rape. So they were taken by the Romans, but for a number of reasons, probably they decided to intervene. One is they are kind of representing what's considered the more female part of human nature, which is mercy, love, caring. And I emphasize this not so much to stereotype male and female behavior, but rather to remind you, or at least to put on the table the idea that human nature could be a composite of very different attitudes and drives and impulses, and probably mercy, love, caring are probably also a part of human nature, as much as the brute intention of killing each other or harming each other. And so this is part of the motivation here. Probably they want to cease fire and find peace. Probably she also wants to save her father, because most likely within this situation, the Sabines are doomed to lose the battle, and therefore this is how they intervene. Moreover, this is at least how the Roman myth tells the story. The Sabine women decided to enjoy the life in Rome and consider it more comfortable, and considered to become Roman citizens instead. And so they kind of assimilated and approved of the new situation they found themselves in. And this is a framework with respect to a very ancient, in this case, even mythological war, I'd like to put on the table before I move on with my more philosophical reflections, because at the end of my presentation, we may probably catch up or follow up on some of these ideas which are represented by the Sabine women. So talking about eternal peace or prevalent peace, which is the more common translation of der ewige Friede, of course, refers to a famous paper by the later Immanuel Kant, published in 1795. And within this paper, a short essay, Kant addresses the question whether something like eternal peace could be possible under what circumstances whatsoever. And the question he raises, put in my words, is: can humanity be permanently dissuaded from regularly murdering each other on grand scale, destroying its resources, and degrading itself morally? Is this possible? Could we imagine a state where we as a human species put an end to war? Is this even conceivable? So we are talking philosophy now. We are not talking international politics also, which is different to some degree. Though Kant always insists that what's convincing in philosophy could and should and must at the long run also be practical in real life. Okay, so, or is it unfortunately the other way around, that eternal peace remains in a philosophical dream, or at best sad reality as a name for cemeteries? So the only condition of eternal peace is when you're dead. And Kant alludes to that. Then he moves on to consider that war is to certain degrees natural. In war, the mad freedom, the unconstrained, unregulated free will of people exposes itself, and it realizes the beastly degradation of humanity as being part of our animal nature, as Kant sees it. War is the only means of necessity in the state of nature where there is no court law that could pass final judgment. So war is also seen as the natural way of solving problems. So Kant, very much like Hobbes and others, thinks of human nature as something which in an uncultivated state will naturally use brute force in order to achieve goals and interests. So this is the state of nature. There is, of course, this is, of course, a questionable understanding of what nature is. His central idea of overcoming war is the establishment of a reasonable legal state of affairs, because what's going on in the natural state is there is no court of law with a final justified judgment. So the solution is establishing social and cultural institutions which are similar to the way we solve conflicts on a more private level, namely by having a court with a judge and legal system So a structure which allows to solve these issues. Historical peace treaties, such as the Westphalia Peace Treaty and others, are his role models. So when he thinks of how could we put an end to war, he refers to these historical cases. And then he moves on with a number of articles. So the paper by Kant consists of six preliminary articles and 3 definitive articles. And I briefly dwell on these articles in the first step. The first article is that no peace treaties shall be valid for such a treaty as has been made with the secret reservation of the substance of a future war. So this basically excludes strategic ceasefire. So, and this is a very current problem, because whenever one of the parties suggests, let's have a ceasefire, the other party might think, okay, this is only to resume energy to have a more vivid war afterwards. And we should probably move on with the war, put an end to it, rather than giving them time to improve their forces and become more problematic in the next step. So the idea of agreeing to a peace treaty should be trustworthy and faithful. No state existing for itself, small or large, this applies equally here, may be acquired by another state by inheritance, exchange, purchase, or gift. So a state is considered a national, it's like a subject. It's an entity with autonomy, which could not be sold and bought like a slave or something. So within the Kantian framework, nation states should be considered as analogous to a person, to a valid subject. Standing armies shall in time cease altogether. This is also a very fascinating claim by, rather than investing more millions, like 2% of the gross income, or 5 probably, or what's on the stage, Kant suggests in order to achieve a state of permanent peace, we should get rid of armies altogether, because having armies has a natural tendency to use them at some point. And it also continues or puts the stage of threatening each other on a long scale. No national debts shall be contracted in relation to external state affairs. So Kant also thinks of the funding of war and suggests that we should not allow debts or funding only for the purpose of attacking somebody, which is a very problematic issue also. No state shall interfere violently in the constitution and government of another state. So other states should have their own will and do as they like, which is in relation to the autonomous concept of the idea that a state is an autonomous institution, which also implies that there should be no interventions, also no humanitarian or regime change interventions. So if a nation decides to have a government such and such, the neighboring countries may dislike it or disapprove it, but according to Kant's view here, it is not allowed to intervene. No state shall permit itself in war with another such hostilities as must render mutual confidence impossible in future peace. So this is, sorry, probably the English is kind of weird, because I translated myself from the original German text and didn't consult the standard English translation because I didn't have it at hand. But what's meant here is that we should not commit activities or hostilities during a war which allow afterwards reconciliation. So we should basically restrain from war crimes. And this leads to or points to the whole domain of jus in bellum. So the war which applies while a war is going on. So there are a number of regulations we have, and we hope to enforce them, that war crimes don't take place, even if the war itself might be justified or not. So this is how Kant conceives of this. And one of the examples he has in mind here is the independence war between the American colonies and the British Empire, which was ended with the official peace treaty signed in Paris in 1783. And I have a picture here by Benjamin West showing this situation. And tellingly, the British representative is not there. So he would be here. This is not a bomb exploding or something. This is just, the picture wasn't finished because the British representative decided to sit on the painting, or wouldn't allow to be sitting there while being painted. So they were still kind of pissed by the outcome of the peace treaty. But we have this double structure here. So we have a preliminary peace, which was signed in November 1782, which is more like a ceasefire agreement. And then you have the proper peace treatment, which was signed in 1783. So considering or conceiving ending of war as a process with a number of steps which are formalized in certain ways is also an idea which dates back to this time. Okay, so the definitive articles tend to make peace perpetual. So the first step is, how do we get in a state of peace, and then how do we ensure that peace remains stable? And Kant is convinced that a peaceful world situation is only possible if every state is republican. And I say a few words about this in a minute. So the Republican Constitution, according to Kant, and also to the thinkers of the French Revolution and the American Constitution. So a Republican Constitution is based on the freedom of all members of a society as human beings. So all considered theoretically, I mean, when they invented that, it didn't apply, of course, it didn't apply to slaves, and it didn't apply to women, of course, and it did not apply to those who have no property. So it was restricted in many ways. But the basic idea, philosophically speaking, was by being a human being, you have the justified claim for freedom and self-regulation. On their dependence on the common law as subjects. So you have the free individuals, you have common law, and the idea that everybody is equal before this law as a citizen. So people are human beings, subjects, and citizens within a Republican constitution, which is obviously pretty different from a condition where you have a monarch and people with no actual freedom. Freedom means obeying only laws to which I have been able to give my consent. So the freedom in accepting laws or accepting laws as ruling over you is something which relies on the possibility or actuality of giving consent. And Kant assumes that therefore war is probably unlikely, because you will hardly find a majority of people saying, yeah, let's go to war, which is probably not the case, unfortunately. Republicanism is not to be confused with democracy, however. Difference between the form of state and the form of government is what Kant has in mind here. A Republican society or a Republican government differs by the form from I should probably stick to what I wrote here. Forms of government such as autocracy, aristocracy, and democracy denote the number of rulers, according to Kant. So the way the ruling process is organized and how many people are in charge to make decisions. Whereas the form of rule is different. And in the Republican government, the form of rule is in contrast to a despotic one. So you may have a despotic democracy, or you may have an autocratic despotism. But the idea with respect to the state of a republic is basically the checks and balances or the division of the forces. So the idea that the Republican form of government is based on the separation of the executive power, the government, from the legislative power. The separation of powers is decisive, not democracy, as insofar as the power of the majority unites the legislative and executive branches, and democracy is therefore, in the proper sense of the word, necessarily a despotism, according to Kant. So Kant, pretty much like Plato and many others, had the idea that democracy would lead to the tyranny of the majority, basically. And the tool to prevent this from happening is actually the division of forces. So having a structure which balances the probably irrational ambitions of a majority of people by a constitution, by a legal system, and by the distinction between executive and law-giving legislative forces. So the second article for Kant, so first step is every country or every nation should be in a republican state. Form of government should be republican. The second is international law should be founded on a federalism of free states. So briefly, probably it helps to think of the analogy of an individual having an argument with his neighbor again. So the idea is we have two nations which are self-legislated free individuals, and they have a conflict. So we need to have a higher organization, like a court or something. They both agree that we should have that, and then they find themselves again there, and then they obey to the laws or decisions, the verdicts made by the court. And this is basically applied to the idea of how we should solve conflicts between nations. While states in the state of nature already damage themselves through their coexistence, so being just next to each other causes problems all the time, and this is what we observe probably, they should, just like individual people, give up their wild, lawless freedom, make themselves comfortable with public compulsory laws, if not in the form of a global world republic, so having a world government and the world legislation and the world peace and the world state, so the whole world as one nation. This is, even Kant considers this too much of an utopia, but probably at least in the form of a war-repelling, existing and ever-expanding federation. So the idea of the United Nations or Völkerbund or something like this is actually a direct derivative of what Kant had in mind here. So we should have a United Nations organization, and within this assembly, we should try to establish a process of lawful interaction. World citizenship should be limited to conditions of general hospitality, which is an interesting case, kind of surprising within the Kantian framework, because one may think, okay, now we have it. But he adds a third issue, which is related to the idea of hospitality. So allowing other people to live in your country for a certain time. He points out explicitly that general hospitality is not a right of hospitality, but a right of visitation. So coming, visiting, staying for a while. It's not the idea, at least in Kant, that people would just move and live in different countries forever, even though this is a necessity for some, unfortunately. To which all men are entitled by virtue of the right common possession of the surface of the earth. So we all have the common possession of the surface of the earth. And therefore, we are kind of free to move around on this surface and enjoy hospitality in other nations for a while. If one compares this with, and this is very, it's not directly related to our topic today, but I wanted to mention that anyways, because Kant is to some degree critically discussed in post-colonial contexts today, and also with some justification, and also what I said about the the lack of women, the natural lack of women to become part of a Republican self-representative is something we may, or we do question today. But when he points to what these Western countries did when they visited other countries all over the world, is very explicit and it's not covered by the idea of general hospitality. If one compares this with the inhospitable behavior of the civilized, primarily trading states of our part of the world, the injustice they demonstrate in visiting foreign countries and peoples, which they consider to be the same as conquering them, is shocking. And this is also something which could be clearly observed already in 1795. I brought you a picture with a quote by Goethe I took in Weimar, where Goethe says that the country which doesn't provide safety for the foreigners will cease to exist soon enough. Pieces of overcoming of the natural state. So I try to summarize what I said about Kant so far. Eternal peace is a... So this is where we were at the minute, based on universal reason. Nature plays an interesting role within this perspective of Kant. And I think this is important for us to follow the idea. So nature has a double role here. On the one hand, the state of nature is the state of arbitrariness, lawlessness, lack of freedom. It is the malignity of human nature that is blatantly evident in the free relationships of people, and war is therefore the state of uncivilized nature. So war is something which is, bottom line, in accordance with nature, and also derives from our anger and drive-driven naturality. At the same time, within a historiography or certain, to some degree, still teleological concept of nature, Kant says that nature as a whole is rational. So, and also achieves a purpose. So nature is designed for a specific purpose, and therefore, by nature, only purposeful things exist. War, too, is an instrument of nature's purpose, he says. So, which is kind of interesting, I think. On the one hand, nature is this arbitrary, lawless situation, and at the same time, the process of nature realizes a certain goal. When I say of nature, it wills that this or that should happen, it does not mean as much as it imposes a moral duty on us to do it, for only non-coercive practical reasons can do that, but it does it in self, we may will it or not. So nature, the historical process, the natural historical process brings a certain result about. And this is what he illustrates with the Greek, with the Latin quotation, fata volentem ducunt nolentem trahunt, which means the fate leads the willing and it carries the unwilling. And this is, so it has its will anyways, which is an idea which we probably put into question today. But I wanted to point out that the idea of having a United Nations Assembly is, I would say, to certain degrees, the institutional political realization, what Kant has in mind when he thinks about the question, how should we, or how could we put an end to war? So it is something which had a huge political impact, in particular, I believe, because the idea of solving these nation-state problems in a similar way as we are successfully solving problems between individuals is very tempting. And it's also to certain degrees successful. Though, as I will move on now, we need to admit that it doesn't solve all the problems we have, apparently. So when I move on, and I think that we need to move on after Kant, I don't mean to say, let's forget about these ideas and the reasoning behind it, but rather take more and different things into consideration. So limits of Kant's philosophy of peace, I would say. Of course, we observe that there's still constant war going on all the time, ever since. And to some degree, as a Kantian philosopher, one may say, yeah, well, this is not an objection against the regulative idea. It doesn't even make this idea wrong. And it also doesn't make the arguments in favor of this idea wrong. It probably stresses some of the instruments we choose. Probably we need to reconsider them. Kant did not know the wars of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. I think this is also very important to keep in mind, that Kant is mainly talking about a situation where a nation state is a pretty new invention, and we have organized wars between governments. And this is very different from what we observed since. So we saw that there was a war, actually one of the most devastating wars of the 19th century, giving in blood count it took was the American Civil War, where we had two Republican states fighting against each other over economic and ideological reasons in a devastating way. We had imperialist wars against unrecognized nations. So the very idea that this is not a nation which we are attacking there. There is no proper government, they are not a nation. It's basically just some people on an unorganized area or so. And this is actually one of the arguments Putin also puts into place and saying, yeah, the Ukraine is no autonomous state. It's basically, it was part of our empire and belongs there. And it's kind of an, yeah, industrialization of war is also something which Kant didn't have in mind, that we would use so much materials and bombs and whatever. Ideologically motivated war of extermination and expulsion, as the war against the Armenian people, for example, or I mean, there are many wars taking place like this, which were within a nation, for example, and Kant has difficulties accounting for them. And then there are asymmetric wars, the war on terror, the situation where we don't have nations fighting against each other. Actually, and this is probably a poison territory, but my impression is that the war between Israel and the Hamas is not, it's something hardly framed within the Kantian framework, because it's not like there are two autonomous nations having a fight with one each other, but the situation is way, way more complicated. Despite the enormous progress in the development of international law and the establishment of international organizations, these institutions also regularly fail. We lost confidence, and this is probably more philosophical now, we lost confidence in the providence of nature or other form of ideology or teleology in history. So we don't actually, I would say, the broadest majority of people thinking about that doesn't really believe anymore that there is some meaning in history and that history is a progress and that it will lead to some positive outcome no matter what we are doing. And that there is this fata volentem ducunt nolentem trahunt thing. This is just not the case. We question also the capacity of reason to produce universal anonymity through insight. So the idea that by pointing to the good arguments and reason, everybody will agree and say, yeah, okay, I admit we shouldn't do that. So this is apparently not working. And therefore, I turn to Habermas in the next step, a German philosopher, still alive, pretty old by now, who aims at a contemporary reformulation of Kant's ideas. And he started that in 1995, when Kant's essay had its 200th anniversary. And he would argue slightly different, but with the same ambition. And his basic idea is we should try to remain in discourse. So we should keep on talking. It's a necessity that we not just point to the truth of some arguments we have, but also continue talking. And what Habermas distinguishes from Kant, it's briefly said, basically the experience of the 20th century. So the Holocaust, Second World War, Stalinism, the obvious failing of the idea of improving, continuously improving the state of affairs for mankind by applying rationality to our interactions, and having these utopian promises being realized by becoming free people in using our own intellectual capacities. This failed to some degree, for probably because of fanatism rather than rationalism. I mean, there's obviously a disagreement about that. Just as little as from history can normatively directed imperatives for reasonable conduct to life be derived from the natural historical constitution of man. This is also a little awkward English, but the idea is we cannot derive what we should do out of history. So we need to define that ourselves. But Kant would at least assume that the universalist position forces us to assume, at least to some extent, evolutionistically, that the rationalization of worldviews takes place through learning processes. So this is really very brief, of course, but I think, I mean, given that I said so much about Kant, it probably suffices to get the idea. So when Kant has the idea of that we will use our reason to agree on truth, Kant, Habermas would rather say we use our reason, constrained reasoning in discourse in order to find a justified consensus. So we find means to agree upon something and consider this to be most likely to be true or close enough to be true or something. But we don't assume truth straightforwardly, but rather have a justified consensus. And we do this by learning processes. So what in Kant is the idea of historical progress, which expresses the will of nature and the purpose of nature, we rather have learning processes. And we see that in the history of mankind, if you look back in the last 2,500 years or so, we probably see that we learned something and improved, which is something many people question. I'm not sure if Habermas is right, but Habermas at least would say. And this is why he actually is so emotional about the European Union. Because to Habermas, the European Union is a really important step in the history of mankind from the natural state towards a state where we would have something like the situation Kant describes. So where we would have a union of republics which interact, and therefore this is not only a political project which fails or succeeds, but rather something which exemplifies that it is possible to have a condition where national egoisms are overdone and transformed into a union of one way or another. And where Kant has the idea of a government of reason, Habermas is also more modest in establishing social institutions which hopefully secure an outcome which is defined by rational consensus. However, Habermas also has a number of problems here, and the one is that he was explicitly disappointed by the way the remaining superpower, the United States, behaved against Iraq in 2003. And he said that with the enforcement of the ban of wars of aggression, so with the enforcement of this by the United Nations, classical international law has taken at least one decisive step on the way to a cosmopolitan state of law. So here you see this evolutionistically line of reasoning in Habermas. So we had this ban of aggression, wars of aggression, and this was a step forward in the process of establishing a cosmopolitan state of law. The United States, which for half a century could be regarded as a pacemaker on this path, not only destroyed this reputation with the Iraq War in 2003 and abandoned its role as a guarantor of international law, with its actions in violation of international law, it set an example for future superpowers to follow. So it also set a bad exemplar. And it's certainly, I mean, it's obviously, Putin didn't fail to mention that. So when he justified the necessity to have a military operation against Ukraine, he said, yeah, look at these. I mean, now the West is blaming us. I mean, look at their record. I don't need to explain myself against them. And this is, of course, sad because the arguments don't get better by just pointing to others who also misbehaved at certain points in history. But it happens. Another feature in Habermas is more recent, and this slightly changes the focus of my presentation for the last 5 to 10 minutes. What startled me in those first days and weeks of the war against Ukraine was the thoughtlessness and short-sightedness of the uninhibited emotional identification with the event of war as such in Germany. So he's talking about Germany. He's not talking from the perspective of a country which has just been attacked. He's talking from the perspective of a country who is a neighboring country, which is not under attack yet. I've never been a pacifist, but he justified the war against Iraq in 1992 and thought that a legitimate case. But I experienced the attack on Ukraine as a fateful violation of an inhibition concerning the archaic violence of war, and an inhibition that had become uncontroversial in Europe. So there was a consensus that war isn't a good thing, and that we should try to do anything, or many things at least, to prevent it from happening, rather than preparing ourselves to be successful part of the next war to come. Yet the outbreak of this war with a nuclear power did not trigger any anguished reflection, but instead immediately prompted a highly emotionalized war mentality, as if the enemies were standing outside of our own door. And this is something I'd like to reflect on for a minute, even though I don't know how this matches with the experience we are making when at the same time the Russian governments find time to consider our institute as a dangerous institution or unwanted institution, which is disturbing. Thinking of peace as the court model. So these are more like a number of ideas towards the end of my presentation. Thinking of peace beyond the court model, I think, is necessary. I think I made clear enough that I don't think that we should just get rid of this court model approach. But I think we do have a number of problems in applying it to the conditions we find ourselves in many, many cases. And in many, many cases, there is no judge, there is no institution which could resume the role of the judge who knows what's going on or tries to find out who was the criminal here and who behaved wrong at first. And so this is very difficult. There is no truth verdict spoken by a higher institution. Therefore, there's also no justice. There's also no justice in a very deep sense, insofar as there is no making good of what happened. And I will say a few more words about this. But first, I want to say something about truth. It is a public saying or a common phrase that truth is the first victim of war. And I think this has a twofold meaning. On the one hand, obviously, as soon as war begins or in preparation of war activities, we have a tremendous rise of ideology, fake news, lies, fabrications, and we also have a very strong emphasis on silencing alternative views or questioning voices. So we don't want to hear somebody questioning what we need to do now. And this is taking place in Russia very straightforwardly, but it's also difficult, of course, in order to keep on the moral and the courage. It's also very complicated in Ukraine to say probably we should think of putting an end to this war because it may have problematic consequences. So one sees that, and this I think points to the second element of the first victim of war's truth, that a war forces those who are touched by it to think in exclusive oppositions of good and bad and find friend and enemy. So war imposes the necessity to think in black and white. And there is not much space for the nuances, the differences, the double-sided features of some events, activities and such. And this makes it very difficult to relate to what's going on there in a solemn way, because this is what war is about. It's not the moment for solemnity, thinking twice, stuff like that. It's the moment of defending yourself against brutal force. So it's a different mode of situation you are in, where this kind of thinking isn't possible. But I think that the philosophical responsibility under these conditions is also twofold. On the one hand, it is necessary to recognize that war is real, that it takes place, that there is injustice happening, and that there's also suffering happening all the time. And also, I think this is probably the most complicated thing. It cannot be undone. So the killed ones are dead, and they don't get alive, whatever you do. So it happened, and it still happens, and it should not happen. But I would also think that in the light of this horror, it is also, I think, necessary to not to give up the privilege of contemplation. So we are sitting here at Sorbonne in the Maurice Halbwachs seminar room, and we are not under attack this moment. So we have the privilege of thinking about what's going on there, and how we should, or how we could contemplate, and how we could think of solutions in the most likely case that this will not just end today, and will also happen again in the future. So how do we deal with it? And I think it must be possible to exchange views about this in an open spirit. Nature's providence has been replaced by conscious and fallible efforts to reach a consensual and justifiable understanding. So this is my approach to summarize some of the ideas. So we have the idea that dialogue complements truth, which also implies that I would say that, I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, there is no alternative to talking to one another. So even on a political scale, sooner or later, people need to talk again. And otherwise, I mean, yeah, the alternative is that one side is completely extinct, which is not going to happen. A universalist rationale is replaced by constant aiming discourse based on the general recognition of shared norms, which must not be in a Kantian spirit universal. It could also be something like the golden rule. And we see that we basically all yeah, I would say that the broadest majority of people agrees that we shouldn't hurt each other unnecessarily. So unless there is this reason or that reason or something. So, but basically, it's not like we need to come up with a new moral theory proving that killing innocent children is evil. I mean, everybody knows that there is no necessity to prove that, I think. And there are also these voluntary commitments, and we see how they also, like the United Nations Charter of Human Rights and others. So we have a framework within which we try to address these. A permanent process of mediating practices to maintain and enable peace takes the place of a treaty-based eternal state of peace. So reconciliation complements justice, and the idea that we need to find ways to reconcile rather than finding justice. And I mean, this is probably not the right moment to think about that for many, or certainly not for those who live in the Ukraine. But I think sooner or later, we need to draw back or come back to those ideas. And this is where I close now, a picture from Weimar, where at the National Theater, since the war started, there was this banner asking for diplomacy, which many consider too much of a straightforward political positioning of the theater, and probably it is. But I like to close with a statement by the Weimar thinker Martin Christoph Wieland, who said, instead of quarreling with each other as to where the truth is, who possesses it, who has seen it in its most beautiful light, who has heard the most and clearest sounds from it, let us walk together in peace. Or when we have had enough of walking, let us sit down under the nearest tree and tell each other frankly, impartially, what each has seen and heard of her, or thinks he has seen. And may most of us find ourselves in situations soon again where this is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It was very, very needed now. So please, your questions, objections, replies, yes.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk about possibly the best known text by Immanuel Kant, at least the most widely discussed, of course, and at the time, probably a revolutionary way of thinking about war and about international conflict. But as you rightly pointed out, Kant didn't know the kind of armed conflict that we are confronted with in the world today. I think that after World War II and even World War II itself, the last case where a sovereign country declared war to another sovereign country that it recognized as a sovereign country was the Falklands War of the United Kingdom against Argentina. And after World War II, that's the single case. There is no other case of a sovereign state declaring war on another state that it recognizes as a state. So in that sense, if we talk today about hybrid warfare, since World War II, almost all warfare has been hybrid in that sense. So it's no longer, there's no longer a classical war. So I think you are right that we have to rethink this whole framework if we want to make sense of the Kantian impulse, as you like it. I've been thinking, of course, while we were talking, and to my mind, we have to rethink perhaps the concept of human nature, in the sense that what strikes me recently when there's wars going on in, of course, Russia's war against Ukraine, but also the war in Israel and many others, there's this classical idea, which I think is also a little bit of Jürgen Habermas's thinking, and that perhaps is also a bit suggested in your talk, namely that the vast majority of people, perhaps even all people, do not desire positively something like war. They do not want to kill other people, or they do not want to see other people killed. So, if that is true, then war is a consequence of misunderstanding, miscommunication, maybe the stupidity of people. And I would suggest that we really have to take into consideration that there are people, and some of them are very powerful people, who maybe do not possibly want to kill other people, but accept the killing of other people as a consequence of what they see is a rational strategy. And fully accept those things, including, and this is something that, so this is a suggestion, and then I have a question, which is whether in Kant you find a discussion of the economic dimension of warfare. And I don't mean the destruction. We find in Kant, of course, the destruction of common goods and things like that. That's obvious. Destruction of farms, of land, whatever. But the positive economic dimension, profit, the fact that war is big business. Maybe it wasn't such a big business in Kant's days, but I think it was also a business. Does he address this at all? That there is something like the positive economic interest of people involved in war, and if so, how do you connect that to human nature? To the question whether we can make a profit on making arms or something like that. Well, that is, and finally, do you not get to a point where you have to say ultimately it's about moral acceptability and not about universal reason? It's a moral issue, maybe.
Yes, sorry, I was disturbed by the machine for so I didn't follow your last twist to the moral versus universal.
Well, okay, let's then drop the last point. And this fact that there is a category of people, including very powerful people, who positively accept the possibility of war, including killing and including lots of destruction.
So yes, thank you very much for this enriching suggestions and questions. And I mean, according to my knowledge, Kant doesn't address the issue of making profit with war. I mean, he points out to the interests, but most times randomly. So the explanations for war happening, why do nations get into war, are more like they're kind of laconic at some point, where it says, yeah, I mean, neighboring countries just disturb each other. This is natural, more or less. And so it doesn't really, like in the case with the Romans and the Sabines, really point to, like, yeah, there is a particular interest in certain resources you like to lay hand on. And the way he describes in critical terms the European imperialism also suggests that, of course, behind it is the trade-making civilization. So there is an economic interest underlying this, but he does not, as far as I can see, address that as a problematic issue that we probably need to, if we think of a world constitution or a situation of eternal peace, that we should also think that we must probably, that this is how I follow up on your question. It follows, I think that we must address the incentives of war. We must produce structures which make it really unattractive to engage in war, and which is not the case for many, obviously. And therefore, he does not address that. He only has this little weird or unexpected preliminary article on you should not be allowed to make debts in order to fund aggressions against other countries, which is an interesting idea because it limits the resources you have at hand or at disposal in order to engage in war. And given that from the state government perspective, you really need funding to buy the weapons and whatever. So it's interesting. I don't know what to make of that. And with respect to human nature, I mean my understanding is that the central ambition of Kant is to find a solution to these issues which focuses on the rational element of human nature. So he's not going into the details whether we are evil or good by nature or whether we are philanthropic or whatever may be as it is. Maybe people are different or so, but the solution must be having a rational and justified state of law, a cosmopolitan state of law enforced. And this is probably expecting too much from reason, and also expecting too much from the ways we are solving conflict. And this is an idea I learned from somebody who was working in mediations after war he was living and working in war regions where like Rwanda, for example, where they're still neighbors, and the neighbors of my neighbors killed my parents, but we are still living here. So what should we do? And he made the experience that it's basically, I mean, in some cases, it is necessary and helpful to put these very dangerous criminals on court and in prison. But there are too many at the end of the day. So you also need to find ways of reconciling. And in order to do this, it's not helpful to try to figure out in detail who was the first who did something and then you did this. And so it's not helpful to try to reconstruct the truth like you would do on court, but rather finding ways of making it possible for the people to start a new living together. And this, I think, it's a very fascinating. It's also a frustrating idea because it takes into account that we will not undo the injustice. And yeah.
We cannot repair.
Yeah, you cannot repair. We cannot repair. But and yeah.
Now, America will change, United States will change the politics towards the war in Russia, for example. What could happen in this context is the European Union, because there are different countries which are trying to be close to Putin's position. What do you think? Hungary, this case. So the common idea of is to neutralize this international inclusive switch coming.
Wow, this is of course hard to tell. I have no philosophically informed view on that, but I mean, at least from the point of view taken by Habermas on the European Union, one must admit that that the idea of overcoming national self-interests in order to achieve a higher standard of political interaction in a cosmopolitan European way, that this goal is at least half achieved, and that that there are strong egoisms taking place within the European Union. And so, which leads to the consequence that different nation states within the European Union have a different policy towards supporting Ukraine or not, or interacting with Russia or not. And so they have different self-interests, also with respect to their voters in their own countries and such things. So this is really like complicated. Moreover, I think it's really important probably for the European Union. I mean, there could be two ways that, I mean, two major arguments, I think, for the European Union to engage as a whole within this conflict. And the one would be that what's taking place here is an attack against the West or the European concept of a global state of affairs. And therefore, under this assumption, the European Union would be asked to engage not only to defend its own interest, but rather to defend or fight in favor of a certain world order. And I think this is probably also what's going on to certain degrees. I mean, this is why the European Union supports Ukraine. But at the same time, you could think of it as something where the European Union has a strategic interest. And these strategic interests, of course, are way more dynamic and diverse. And therefore, yeah, also with respect to the question how long it takes. I mean, this is also very visible, I think, that the attitude towards the war in Ukraine changed during the duration of it. I mean, at the very beginning, I mean, many people in the West thought, okay, there's not much we can do about it. Russia will bring about a regime change in Kiev within 2 months or something. And this is probably what Putin also thought. And then we need to deal with the new situation. But this didn't take place. So, and then, okay, so apparently there's time also to financially, militarily support without risking an open war between the NATO and Russia. And at the end of the day, probably it's, I mean, mentioning the NATO, this is probably the more relevant figure. I mean, and at the end of the day, it's the United States. But for the United States, of course, this is a very different kind of conflict. I mean, from the perspective of the United States, this is a conflict taking place somewhere in Europe. And whereas for us, it's a conflict taking place next door. And which, yeah. But I have no prognosis on what's going on.
Kant talks a lot about university, I think, universal reasoning, that kind of stuff. And it's also a bit of a Western perspective. Do you think you can put this reasoning and whole framework also into the rest of the world, or is it more like really Eurocentric? Something you can talk about some of the brain universal, but maybe like look at China or Taiwan, for example. Can you also say we can look at that in this way, or is it more maybe a bit too focused on?
I mean, my main field of research is Nietzsche and post. I mean, I'm pretty much engaged with philosophers who question the idea of universal reasoning. But I would still argue that that at the end of the day, there is a huge intercultural agreement on a number of moral values. So I think that the idea of the Kantian universalism did not, said it briefly, I think it did not succeed. So it is a particular way of thinking, which is very smart and straightforward and helpful in many ways. But given, for example, the categorical imperative, according to my understanding, Kant did not succeed to prove this as a universally true maxim we should obey. But what we could perceive at the same time is that something like the golden rule, so don't do unto others what you don't want to perceive yourself, is a moral norm which is present in almost any world religion. In many countries, there are proverbs in many different, in like 80 different languages. So this is really like a very widespread agreement among people, and I think we could relate to those. Because I don't think that the differences between different cultures, we have more or less emphasis on the individual or the subject, for example, in the traditional Chinese context, for example. But this doesn't render the idea of the ambition to pursue a pleasant life in peace to something which is culturally different also. And therefore, with respect to the issue of peace and war, I don't think that the arguments against it and the refined institutions which we established to counter it are just a Eurocentric Western thing. And what the other point, I briefly mentioned the United Nations Charter of Human Rights, which is an agreed upon document where 192 nations signed that they consider these elementary rules of conduct and human rights. So, and they did that out of a autonomous free spirit. It was a decision. So there may be many different justifications for the validity of these particular values, but at least one can see that a broad majority of institutions and people subscribe to them, and this, I think, is sufficient, and it's also all we have, I would say.
Can I pose another question, if there are no further questions? About this follow-up to Ruben's question about reason and universalism. There is this, and you mentioned it in your talk, this idea of the just war. Right? And the key idea is that a just war is only a defensive war is a just war. If all parties in conflicts would live by that rule, there would be no war. And anybody who starts the war in the world today, including President Putin, but also many others, will try to frame their war as a defensive war. The West started the war against Russia. Russia is only defending its legitimate interests. Now, if we want to get out of the riddle where any war is being presented as being defensive, which is clearly untrue, because if that were true, there would be no wars. What is the role of truth and reason in deconstructing those narratives? Can you address those narratives simply by saying we have to move to reconciliation, where it's a matter of give and take, avoiding the question of lying, the question of truth, and the question of guilt? How do you move around reason there, or universal truth? If you look at World War II, for example, it was ended with the occupation of Germany and the other Axis countries. And there was a clear answer to the question, who was guilty of this horrible war? And that was the starting point of European unification also. And Germany went through a whole process of recognition of this guilt and Vergangenheitsbewältigung and all those things. Can you go around that? Can you avoid that sort of thing, which is more than just reconciliation? Like, okay, we started a fight, you had a point, I had a point, we shouldn't have been fighting. Which might be reasonable, but avoids the question of truth.
Yeah. I mean, this is really a pressing question, because there the question of truth comes back in a more down to earth.
Yeah, comes back through the back door.
Yes, it comes back to the back door, and more pressing so. And in this case, I mean, at that stage, I would say we need to find or we need to agree on a certain framing of how we perceive this event afterwards. So how we define who's guilty and who's not guilty, or who was the victim and who was the actor here, or more so and less so. And in some cases, this turns out to be clear, straightforward, and helpful. And in particular, with respect to Germany, it was because this was a peculiar condition. Probably this is not so exemplary for, let's say, the war in Yugoslavia or so. I mean, in Germany, you had, given the incomprehensible scale of crime, there was just no way of saying, yeah, we only did what they all did or something. So this was just not possible, even though the broad majority of people in Germany living in the 50s, 60s, 70s was convinced that we were basically not much worse than the others, and certainly not as worse as the Russians or something. So, but in the framework of international relations and in a public scale, it was accepted. And then there was a very interesting process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or Auseinandersetzung, engagement with this guilt. But I don't think that this is so clear in many other cases. And therefore, I see that at some point it is necessary to agree on these questions. I mean, that both parties of the war agree on who was guilty here. This might be necessary and helpful under certain conditions. And with respect to third-party observers, there will be many who say this one was guilty and this one was the victim, and so. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think truth gets back in here in a more forcing way. But still finding the truth, I mean, having a bunch of this, I mean, a bunch doesn't, I didn't mean to say bunch in a derogatory way, but having historians and political analysts figuring out who was guilty here and who not, I would say doesn't probably play the decisive role in finding a solution to the problem. Thank you.